Welcome to the Sparked podcast, the show that will get you fired up about standards. On today's show, we have Kate Ebrill, Interoperability Lead at CSIRO's Australian eHealth Research Centre and National Lead at Sparked FHIR Accelerator, David Hansen, CEO and Research Director at CSIRO's Australian eHealth Research Centre, and Mark Braunstein, Visiting Scientist at CSIRO. By the end of today's episode, you'll know more about the future of FHIR in healthcare. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome everyone. We're talking future science here today on the issue of Sparked and FHIR. And I've got three terrific guests in David, Kate and Mark. I'm going to start with my team member and CEO of the Australian eHealth Research Centre and Research Director, David Hansen. David, why did CSIRO, as the National Science Agency, start playing with FHIR, quote unquote, right after it ignited almost 10 years ago?
So great question, Brett. We started doing a lot of work with SNOMED as a clinical terminology to enable interoperability. And we actually built a terminology server which wasn't based on FHIR. And so our terminology server predates FHIR. But when Graham started working on FHIR, he actually came to us and said, proper integration of terminology into the messaging stack is really, really important. And can you help me with what that looks like? And so we were at the beginning of FHIR and what that terminology API should look like. That enabled us to convert our existing terminology server to be a FHIR terminology server. And I guess the rest is history in terms of us having a really full implementation of the FHIR terminology server. It's the best one on the market in terms of a commercial terminology server. And because doing so much else across the lab in terms of imaging and genomics and mobile health, etc., it was just natural for us to then embrace the rest of FHIR and look at how we could use that, across the lab. So that's how we got involved in the FHIR world.
Terrific. And look, a follow-up question for you, and then I'll go to Kate. Where do you see FHIR as both a research focus for CSIRO and more broadly, but as well as enabling CSIRO's research?
We still largely work on FHIR as in development of various parts of the standard. And a great example is the work we're doing at the moment with a tool called Pathling, which is an open source tool, which is now an emerging standard in the FHIR world called SQL on FHIR. There's now 6 or 7 tools. Google has SQL on FHIR, Pathling type API within their open health toolkit. Microsoft and some others, Health Samurai, have got various implementations, and now all of those different groups are coming together to standardize that. The important part of that is that it will give a lot more tools. Once we have an SQL interface to all that FHIR data, that then enables a lot of other tools, whether it's for research or clinical purposes, to be able to access that FHIR data for their research or for their clinical work. So we still continue to develop parts of the FHIR standard, and then through things like Sparked, we're very involved in the implementation of FHIR, and that's going to include into the research world. We've already got FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the US, with accepting FHIR for approval and our regulatory standards. And then a big part of where I see FHIR supporting research is in the implementation of tools into things like electronic medical records, where we can use Smart on FHIR applications, which I'm sure Mark will talk about shortly, to implement some imaging algorithms or AI algorithms into the electronic medical records. So FHIR is going to play a big part in the transition of research into healthcare as well as supporting research.
David, you mentioned pharmacogenomics. What does that mean in a practical sense? Give me an example of it.
I think most of pharmacogenomics at the moment is used in cancer treatment, so using someone's genomic information to decide which drug, or the tumour's genomic information, to decide which drug is going to target best that tumour or the genome of the person. But we're going to see other applications come in. We'd all probably be a little surprised on the fact that a lot of drugs actually only work on 50 or 60% of people, and that will have some sort of genomic basis. And once we start to tease those out, we can provide much better targeted treatment to people, whether it's pain relief or lots of other everyday diseases. But at the moment, pharmacogenomics is largely in the cancer area.
Thanks, David. Kate Ebrill, Sparked Powerhouse. I don't think that's your official title, but that's my title for you. Do you see a similar promise in the research space for FHIR and SQL on FHIR? It's got to be called Squirrel on Fire, surely.
That's way better. Squirrel's way better. Yeah, absolutely. Because I think one of the key things around the Spark program is really improving data quality. First and foremost, how do we get better data quality within systems that allows us to start to build that ground truth for where we want to go in the future with all of our work in this research space? At the moment, we're sharing data that's like sharing apples, oranges, maybe a banana. But what we're trying to do fundamentally is really improve that quality of data at the point of care, improve that quality of data flowing through the system, then improve that quality of data that can start to then be analysed with things like SQL on FHIR, and then start to improve work where we can start to look at better predictive algorithms, or everyone's favourite thing is an ambient scribe at the moment. But fundamentally, we need to start to improve the quality of data, to improve the quality of those ambient scribe tools so they start to deliver on the promise. I see that Sparked is really kind of both foundational to getting that good quality data out there to improve where we go, and then it enables our systems to integrate those tools that David was talking about. So if we can then have Smart on Fire apps that start to integrate within electronic medical records, because it actually can start to leverage the data with this, which is in those systems.
So tell me about ambient scribes. What are they and what does it mean in clinical practice?
You know, there's been a lot of uptake around ambient scribes, particularly within primary care, which is fantastic because it enables when you're having a consultation with a patient for it to actually record the information for you. And so you can have a much more meaningful conversation with the patient, with the consumer, rather than being focused on typing the information into your electronic medical record. That has huge, huge potential. However, what we need to get is not just going from voice to text, but how do we go from voice to text to that structured information? Because we still want to be able to exchange that structured information with other providers in the care chain and through things like health information exchanges. So how do we ensure that we have that underlying quality structured data that we can use to build the ground truth to ensure that the way these ambient scribes work, that we can go from that voice to that text within that record, that summary of that consultation, but importantly, underneath, have that information be coded in the right way. We hear a lot about hallucinations when it comes to large language models. One of the challenges is, at least when it's going from voice to text, we can actually see on the screen if it's picked up the wrong word. But if underneath it's structured and coded, we don't see that. So we've got a lot more research validation to do to make sure that we can actually get from that voice to text to voice to code to have that underlying structured information flow throughout the system.
Are we doing work in this ambient scribe space in Australia?
We're not doing work directly ourselves on building an ambient scribe, but we're working with some of the companies who are providing ambient scribes to look at that text-to-code type aspect that Kate talked about. And that obviously ties in with our terminology server. If we're given some text, how do we relate that to a SNOMED code or a LOINC code or a medicine's terminology? Then from a product point of view, how does that sit within either OntoServer or on top of OntoServer so that industry, as they use ambient scribes and other automated ways of putting text into electronic medical records, how are we able to enable them to pick that up and implement it easily into their systems? So that's one aspect. And then obviously large language models, we're doing a bunch of work in many different areas, whether it's creating discharge summaries from electronic medical records or some great work from our imaging team in going directly from a chest x-ray to a radiology report, which recently won an international competition at a big international conference. So doing lots of work and then starting to trial that with some of our partners here in Australia.
And now it's time for a fun fact from Kate.
FHIR is a HL7 standard. It stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. Clinical terminology provides the language of healthcare. SNOMED, systemised nomenclature of medicines. SNOMED is one of those clinical terminologies that's globally recognised.
Fantastic. And Mark, you're not one of my team. You're a very distinguished ring-in. Do you have a view on FHIR? Is this nidus for research opportunities in bringing data in?
Absolutely. I got on board the FHIR train about 2014, so I'm a long-time advocate of the technology. One use case that has interested me is the problem of matching patients to clinical trials, which is an essential part of medical research. Most medical research involves ultimately things on real patients. I find it really exciting that within AHL7, there's a computable knowledge effort that is defining sophisticated FHIR resources that can actually represent medical knowledge and can represent the criteria for clinical trials. And in fact, they've posted a tool online that you can use and go to the US clinicaltrials.gov site and get any of the clinical trials converted to FHIR format. The other side of that is once the clinical trial is in a FHIR format, matching a patient to it, which involves analyzing a patient's EMR record or EHR record and ideally converting it to FHIR resources. And people are starting to do that as well. This is important because even in cancer, which is obviously where there's enormous focus, only about 7% of patients engaged in a clinical trial. So you can envision in the not very distant future at all, a physician using their electronic health record could have a smart on FHIR app, and they literally ask the app, given the specifics of this patient's clinical situation, show me some clinical trials for which they're a good candidate. I don't think we're very far away from that. And I can see that enormously increasing the participation in these trials.
So a genuine enabler for engagement, but in a targeted and smart way.
Yeah, but all of this only becomes possible when there's an underlying standard. Of course, I'll switch gears a little bit. Everybody these days is interested in AI. And the more you dig into it, the more critical it becomes, at least in healthcare, that these models are trained on reliable, ideally structured data. That largely solves the hallucination problem, which of course comes about because the models are trained on data which may or may not be valid. And we're already seeing that starting to happen. There are 2 or 3 companies that I follow. These are all US-based companies. I wish I had a good Australian example, which are building models based on structured data, often in FHIR format, and which can answer interesting questions, such as what would the optimal care plan be for this patient going forward? Or given the care that this patient is currently receiving, what would you forecast as the clinical outcome? So there's a lot of exciting stuff going on. We have a way to go, of course, before it becomes mainline medicine. But I think these are the kind of use cases that will become mainline medicine in the not terribly distant future.
Thanks, Mark. And David, what are your reflections on some of the other potential use cases that are emerging or in the not too distant future?
Look, I think healthcare's got some great things coming down the line at us in terms of technologies. Mark's talked about AI, which is obviously going to be a big one, whether we're using FHIR data for training those AIs or implementing particular algorithms within a Smart on FHIR app sitting within an electronic medical record. FHIR complementing the AI. FHIR complements the AI in lots of different ways. So that's an exciting area. The other big technology, which I think healthcare is grappling with to implement and work out how to implement in a really good way, is genomics, and whether that's using genomics at the point of needing a diagnosis, whether it's for a rare disease or a cancer, or whether we take a more lifetime approach in terms of producing a DNA sequence which will inform our healthcare into the future. Having a really good way of accessing the data, keeping it private and secure, and then using it for whether it's pharmacogenomics, I think will be a big application in the future, through to diagnosis and therapeutic decision making. Again, having a standard way of accessing the data and of sharing the results is going to be really important. There's already a lot of work internationally around genomics and HL7 and FHIR. So I think that's another area where we're really going to see some emergent technologies into the future. And there's an AI story around that, of course, as well.
The other data set that needs to be mentioned is typically referred to as real-world data. People have phones, watches, devices, rings that track their activity, track their physiologic status. That needs to be brought into the FHIR world. It needs to become a part of the actual record of the patient. It needs to be available for research and treatment decisions and that sort of thing. We still have a way to go to make that happen, but the basis for it is there today. I look forward. It seems inevitable to me that people are going to start producing devices that natively speak FHIR. We're not quite there yet, but I think it's coming.
Thanks, Mark. I'm not sure I need to communicate that I've slept in for 3 extra hours on a Sunday through my watch, but I can see the potential. It's all in the precision medicine space. Great reflections on the fact that if we have rubbish in, we get rubbish out. And so we need that proper standard for FHIR to make sure that our AI and any other tools are using robust data sets. Kate, some reflections on future directions.
Mark and David have talked about the future. I think there's also just in the immediate and very near future, how we can just improve the experience for clinicians and for consumers through these data standards and the reuse of data. Just talking about things like Smart on FHIR apps, smart forms, making it a better experience for clinicians with their data being able to be reused. Enter data once, reuse many, and have that data be traceable up through the system from primary use through to population use. And so I think that's the really immediate kind of benefit where we can start to see. And if we move forward from there, now we have better quality data, we can actually start to feed in and understand and improve our knowledge, improve our clinical guidelines, and then how do we deliver that knowledge back to improve decision support at the point of care in, again, a much more user-friendly way. Having that better quality data underneath that can start to provide context, specific summaries of information to clinicians, improving the way that information can be provided to both the clinician and the consumer in different ways. How does it just improve the experience for people? How does it improve the way they interact with the healthcare system? Which is also hugely important around reducing that burden of effort around trying to synthesize all of this information and reproduce all of this information. Those benefits are going to come much, much faster, hopefully in the kind of next months and years, not even further down the track.
Yeah, it still puts the clinician at the centre of the decision-making process, but they go into it eyes wide open with all of the information that they would like to have at their disposal to make the best choices for their patients.
100%. And stop re-entering data multiple times. I mean, how many times do you enter data once as a clinician and have to enter that same data over and over again? And we talk about consumers not having to retell their story. That's fundamentally important as well. Consumers having their story at their fingertips and having access to that, but also clinicians having that data in the way they need it, and also clinicians entering that data once and getting that data reused many times. And then we actually start to drive that better quality data being used through the system, and that data can then come back in the form of improved algorithms, improved decision support tools that then get to, we keep talking about this learning healthcare system, and this standard starts to really underpin that ability to move towards this learning healthcare system that we've all talked about for a number of years.
Let's go to that. David, what does a learning healthcare system mean to you? How does FHIR enable us to move towards that goal?
I think the learning healthcare system is all about getting information and what works across the healthcare system and making sure that people are aware of the latest evidence. And obviously we can't do that without providing it digitally. The whole digital health agenda is vitally important to turning our current healthcare system into a learning healthcare system. One area which brings the learning healthcare system together with what Kate was talking about, collecting data using multiple times, is around surveillance and infectious diseases. And if we can use the data that's collected at the point of care without many manual interventions, that we can really trust it to be really good quality data, and it can be transformed into the data which is required for surveillance, other purposes at a population level. That enables us to do a lot better in situations where we have outbreaks of infectious disease, but also for monitoring the ongoing health of the population and having better population health statistics. So really linking that primary care and the primary use of data through to all of those population statistics is a big part of the learning healthcare system.
Fantastic. Thank you. Mark, similar reflections from a US perspective?
Well, yes. I want to mention a company that I'm involved with, which always makes me a little uncomfortable, Remedy. I'm on their board. Just to emphasize to the listeners that this isn't that far off in the future. In fact, it's here today in some respects. So it's a pure FHIR solution. And today it runs as a smart suite, really, within all the major US EMRs. It's installed in over 50 health systems. And it brings together the patient's EMR data, the patient's device data from home, a CDS hooks-based clinical decision support and reuses that information for former population health, which diabetic patients in the practice that we really need to focus on, for example. So this stuff is doable today. It's still early days, and it all rests on standards. It all rests on the sort of thing that Spark is building for Australia. Without that, there is no lingua franca. There is no data that we can rely on for any purpose, no matter what its source, which should be our objective.
And Kate, what do you think this lingua franca can do? Or is it Esperanto, one of them?
I think the huge opportunity is it allows us to take these tools, like Mark is mentioning, where validated tools that might be around decision support or algorithms, and actually deploy them much more rapidly and across the country. Because often what happens is we get new evidence, we build a new tool, but it becomes an integration with every single vendor or every single system, one integration at a time, and we can't actually deploy that rapidly. And so it allows us to scale and be much, much more agile, which allows us to, if it's emerging pandemics or if it's new decision support that's required, we can actually get that out into systems much more rapidly, which instead of being 6 months, 12 months, 18 months of integration time, these things can be deployed. And so I think it allows us to get the knowledge, get the evidence, turn that into a tool and get that tool deployed at scale. And this creates huge opportunity, whether it's at a national policy level or whether it's actually really supporting innovation in the marketplace, because you can still have your large statewide platforms, your large enterprise EMRs, but still enable that best of breed innovation, that best of breed practice to be able to be deployed. That's where there's such opportunities for clinicians and for industry and government into being able to enable this innovation.
And there must be clinical insights that happen in various corners of the world that in some ways need to be shared at a rapid pace. We don't want a system that's pulling the World Book Encyclopedia off the shelf and photocopying and sending through the mail. We want the Wikipedia version that disseminates that understanding instantaneously. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, this is a problem I've been interested in for a long time. How do you represent clinical knowledge, clinical decision-making in a shareable form? And without boring people with details, there was an effort called Arden that was developed many years ago to try to do that. And it bogged down because of the very problem that Kate was alluding to. If you wanted to move a rule from one EMR to another, you had to re-implement it because there was no standard for the data and there was no standard for accessing the data. Today, that effort is wrapped into HL7 and FHIR. It's important that developers can produce a smart app that will work with any EMR, but when you get to clinical logic, the thing that CDS-Hooks doesn't do, it counts on something else to actually provide the clinical logic. It's important that that be in a FHIR-based shareable form. And although there isn't much attention being paid to that quite yet, I think the people who are paying attention to it are doing something important.
David, it's a real democratization of information sharing. Is the Australian ecosystem ripe for that process to unfold? We've got rare cancers, we've got genetic insights that are actually applicable across the country.
I think Sparked and also the work that the agency is doing now around replatforming My Health Record to be FHIR-based is kind of setting the national direction. We're an interesting country in that we're kind of big enough to do this ourselves, but we need to depend on lots of other products coming in from overseas. Sparked and the agency and the Department of Health and Aged Care really setting the direction on FHIR is really important. That means industry gets the signal that this is the direction we're going with using FHIR as that underlying sharing standards. The nice thing about FHIR is that it is based on modern computer science. HL7 version 2, which is a very successful standard for, and really, you know, our hospitals would grind to a halt without all the HL7 version 2 messages flying around, but that's kind of 1980s computer science. And so moving to FHIR means the transition from bringing in a new graduate who knows nothing about healthcare but knows everything about modern web technologies to be able to work on FHIR standards is a lot quicker than trying to upskill them on 1980s computer science and everything in healthcare. we've got many of the right ingredients and we're heading in the right direction now, and it's an exciting time. So Sparked, we're going to need to make sure that we're developing our workforce. It's still a really important issue, and we've been working with the agency and others on a number of initiatives around increasing the workforce that know enough to be implementing FHIR and FHIR-based standards. Kate and I and Mark have been around for a long time, and it does feel a bit like it's all coming together now, which is exciting.
Thanks, everyone. So we've had a fantastic dive into future science, some of the exciting use cases that are emerging now and are just on the horizon in the use of FHIR as a real enabler for some really exciting things in the clinical space.
The Spark podcast is brought to you by the Australian Federal Department of Health and Aged Care, CSIRO's Australian eHealth Research Centre, HL7 Australia, and the Australian Digital Health Agency. You can join the community by heading to sparked.csiro.au. And don't forget to join us on LinkedIn at SparkedAU. This show is hosted by me, Brett Sutton, Director of Health and Biosecurity at CSIRO, and produced by Edge Studios' Janine Hamer and Lucy Ratz, and CSIRO's Dr. Naomi Stecklenburg. Sound by Hayley Dell.